Thanks for coming to this event, Science, Politics and the Public, Breaking Down the Barriers. My name's Andrew Roberts. I'm the Dean of the College of Physical and Mathematical Sciences here at the ANU. Science is rather big here at the ANU. This event is sponsored by the two science colleges which make up about half the university. And this week we've had several hundred scientists converge on Canberra for an event called Science Meets Parliament. And it's been an opportunity for scientists to engage with politicians and to learn more about how to engage in the dialogue in both directions because of the languages that are spoken in both activities being very different. And this event is a follow-on from that. It's an attempt for our scientists to engage with the public, but also to talk about the process of politics. And we've got a great lineup of people here to help us with that process this evening. I'm very grateful to Brian Schmidt and Richard Dennis, and Alex Sloan is going to chair proceedings. You might recognize her voice, but not know the supermodel face. Alex is embarrassed? No. Alex is the voice of ABC 666 in the morning, and if you recognize the voice but not the face, that's why. But thanks for coming, and over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Professor Roberts. You should be very careful about what you put on websites 20 years ago, even in jest. Yes, I'll be moderating tonight's event, and we hope for a relatively casual evening. And I'm going to ask our great panellists some questions, but we're also going to allow questions throughout, as well as at the end. So if you do have questions, if you urgently want to raise your hand, and our beautiful assistant here will bring the microphone to you. Please be patient as we may not get to questions from everyone about each of the topics. If you want to tweet, it's hashtag SPPANU. There's also at Cosmic Pinot and at the Oz Institute.
Is it? I'm not much of a tweeter.
Time you were, Richard.
The Oz Institute.
The Oz Institute.
The Oz Institute.
Oh,
thank you, bro.
You don't have a phantom tweeter, do you?
Not that I know of.
Okay, good.
So did they need any introduction? But I will do the introduction. Professor Brian Schmidt is a Laureate Fellow at the Australian National University's Mount Stromlo Observatory. Brian was raised in Montana and Alaska in the US and received undergraduate degrees in physics and astronomy from the University of Arizona in 1989. Under the supervision of Robert Kirshner, he completed his astronomy master's degree in 1992 and a PhD in 1993 from Harvard University. In 1994, he and Nick Suntsev formed the High-Z-SN Search Team, a group of 20 astronomers on 5 continents who used distant exploding stars to trace the expansion of the universe back in time. The group's discovery of an accelerating universe was named Science Magazine's Breakthrough of the Year for 1998. The work on the accelerating universe was awarded the 2011 Nobel Prize in Physics jointly with Adam Rees and Saul Perlmutter. Brian is now continuing his work using exploding stars to study the universe and is leading Mount Stromlo's efforts to build the SkyMapper telescope, a new facility that will provide a comprehensive digital map of the southern sky from ultraviolet through near-infrared wavelengths. Please welcome Professor Brian Schmidt. On my left, Dr. Richard Dennis is Executive Director of the Australia Institute, which is a public policy think tank based in Canberra. Richard is an economist by training and has worked for the past 20 years in a variety of policy and political roles. In recent years, he has been at the forefront of the national policy debates surrounding climate change policy and the Australian mining boom. He is an adjunct associate professor at the Crawford School of Economics and Government at the ANU. And prior to taking up his position, Richard was the strategy advisor to the leader of the Australian Greens, Senator Bob Brown, was Chief of Staff to the then leader of the Australian Democrats, Senator Natasha Stott-Despoja, and has held teaching and research jobs at Australian universities. Please welcome Richard Dennis. So the first question will be to you, Professor Schmidt. You attended, he's had a very busy week and it's great that he's here, but you attended Science Meets Parliament early in the week. What do you see as the value of such an event? What did you get out of it?
So for me, it's really a chance to get scientists and politicians talking to each other. Because you see, scientists see the world one way, Politicians see it another way. We both have a lot to bring to the table, but we're very different in our approach to life. And one of the best ways to advance the arguments of how science and evidence-based policy needs to inform politics is to actually get people talking to each other and comfortable with the way we see the world and discuss it and realize that there are differences. So it's not about just training the politicians about science, it's also training the scientists about politicians.
Are they interested in science?
My experience is pretty good. We had 50 of them up on the roof of Parliament House on Monday, and they were all looking up and seemed really excited about it. It's about and they were from all parties. They were talking to each other. They weren't punching each other out. They seemed to be enjoying each other's company. It was a good event. Yeah, okay. I'm very excited about it.
Richard, from your political background, did you find there was a problem with scientists and politicians actually speaking different languages and a disconnect there?
Yeah, look, fundamentally, and Brian said, scientists speak one language, politicians speak another. I'm an economist. We've got a language all of our own. We've got a world all of our own. So it's not uncommon that people with expertise and people who are elected to represent us find it hard to find common ground, common language, common issues. But I do think that scientists are at a particular disadvantage, frankly, in the political process, because scientists are designed and trained to be open and honest and transparent and cautious and careful and reflective and talk about the problems with their research. And it's the exact opposite of the soundbite. It's the exact opposite of the I've got a simple solution to tell you. So I think but at the same time, scientists have got a particularly important role to play in what we call evidence-based policy. Now that said, I haven't seen a lot of evidence. There is evidence-based policy, but everyone says that's what they'd like to have. Well, you can't say you want to have evidence-based policy and have structures or cultures that are hard for scientists to insert themselves into. So I think there's room for movement on both sides, but ultimately we want scientists to keep doing what they do, and I think politicians and the media need to reflect on why it's so hard for scientists to push themselves in.
Is that because you have been trained to always tell the truth, that nuanced language or telling lies is not part of how scientists are trained?
If you spin as a scientist, you're going to be caught out, your reputation is going to be shattered, and you're going to be flipping burgers a few weeks later. So you don't do it. It's a real defense mechanism.
So if this was part of the process of getting a better relationship to get scientists and politicians, do you think you've cracked a kind of little sliver of light there? Or?
This has been going on for 13 years. And when I first came to Science Meets Parliament 13 years ago, I was involved in the first one as quite a young, bright-eyed postdoc here at the ANU. And literally when you were talking and trying to get the ideas, you'd see the politicians roll their eyes. As in, oh God, what are we doing? They don't do that anymore. They want to try to make it work now. I'm not saying we're there yet, but at least I see we've had a shifting of expectations. It's not, oh, this is something we have to do. Just to put up appearances. I think there's a genuine belief we need to try to figure this out. We haven't figured it out yet, but I think we have a cultural shift.
Richard?
Look, I think that's right, but at the same, there's two things. First, there's a pragmatic thing. Most academics I know never read Hansard. That, by the way, is the Journal of Parliament. And most parliamentarians I know never read journals. All right? Now, they're both, therefore, equally guilty of virtually completely ignoring the main vehicle for understanding what people's issues are. So that structural problem's not going to go away, but it's somebody's job, and I think Science Meets Parliament has done a good job of this, and I've been involved in it, sort of giving cheap advice for many years as well, not as many as Brian, but someone's got to build a bridge between those two worlds. They should be different worlds. They should stay apart, but it's somebody's job to it needs to be somebody's job to try to bring them together. So that's the first thing. But then let's be honest, these are bad days for science in public debate. I don't think 10 years ago political or public debate would have been as flippant in dismissing science or the motivations of science. I mean, you know, for me, the most alarming thing that's happened through the climate change debate has been people actually standing up and saying, well, you can't trust scientists. They're motivated to win grant funding. I mean, that is, no, seriously. I mean, the fact that people who make billions of dollars selling fossil fuels are the ones chucking the allegation that other people are motivated by money is a little bit odd for me. But that, I mean, that's such a low blow that 10 years ago you wouldn't have even thought someone would throw it.
But I think there's a difference. 10 years ago, I quite frankly just felt like we were just plain ignored, period. Now we are being in the mix, we matter. The stakes are risen, we become targets in the political debate. And I think one of the things about Science Meets Parliament is about how to figure out how to play in that debate more successfully than maybe we have in the climate change debate, where quite frankly, we've had our wins and our pluses and minuses.
So you're saying that even if it's bad attention, even if it's science being called all the names under the sun, it's better than not being talked about at all?
Yeah, it's actually more respectful, believe it or not, to be, name called than just being ignored. I mean, literally, when you're ignored, it's just like there was no input. And we matter now. That's why things have gotten ugly.
Yeah. By the way, I agree. I think it is better to be attacked than ignored.
Yep.
But I wouldn't have anticipated that attack 10 years ago. So I think you're right. Unfortunately, the attack has come because of the importance of science. You know, so I personally wouldn't have anticipated that, and I think it's it's a poisoned well that we'd do well to avoid.
If we do have the hope to get science-based policy implemented, do scientists or politicians need to do the work here?
I think we need to understand each other. I think we need to have a respect for each other's ways of dealing with information. So one of the things I've been advocating is that we have to have consensus groups of scientists, because every scientist has an opinion, and there's always a diversity of opinion on an issue. And so if you go through and say, well, give me the black and white answer, you're never going to get one in science, because everyone has a slightly different answer, and there will always be a credible scientist who will disagree with the status quo. That is the way science works. Politicians don't realize that. They think there is an answer. There is never an answer in science. There is our best answer given the information we have. And so I think we have to go through and develop structures as scientists which have credibility and ultimately the respect of government. And it's sort of a branding exercise. We're not quite used to it, but if we don't do that, then they can just break us apart into individual units, and it becomes a melee in the media, and we give conflicting answers that no one understands. We have zero effect.
But, I mean, I agree that's important, but again, there's no economists in the room, luckily it's only being recorded. My profession couldn't care less if people disagree. Economists disagree with each other all the time. It doesn't stop policymakers taking economics seriously and choosing evidence based on the balance of probabilities. I mean, there is no unanimity about what does and doesn't, solve unemployment or reduce inflation, and no one knows exactly what the Reserve Bank should or shouldn't do about interest rates. But the irony is, economists have got one trick that scientists haven't learned. We don't publish error bars. There's no margin of error in any of our forecasts. Seriously, look around. Like, we forecast to 4 decimal places with no margin for error. And because the public and the politicians confuse precision with accuracy. And the scientists and my point is, please don't change science. But I don't think we need to understand that politicians and the public can and do make decisions under uncertainty. But I think economists are better salespeople of uncertainty, which is intellectually dishonest. But we're better salespeople. We don't know how to stop a GFC. Obama could get as much economic advice as he could possibly want to pay for. And we don't know what to do. But people still take, the balance. If most economists say something's a good idea, politicians are comfortable with ambiguity.
But I think there's within economics, and truth be said, my wife is an economist, who I think you know,
Yes.
and there's usually a range of solutions that have a different underpinning assumptions. And so I always think of economics providing sort of a family, and you can be sort of the left end of the family or the right end of the family, and there's uncertainty in addition to that, but you have that dimension of what truth is based on your underlying assumptions. Now, science is a little different than that. We always try to think of science as being, this is what we're going to predict the future, there's an uncertainty, but there isn't a range, a political spectrum of assumptions underlying it. In at least the way we normally do things. So that's a little bit different, and that's why I think economists can get away with it, because you actually have uncertainty in, even if you think there's only one assumption. But then there's the political spectrum of assumptions, which ends up completely dominating the debate, and that's how I think we get away with it.
I agree, but just bad. I agree. But let's understand what Brian just said. It's only because we've got such low expectations of economists that no one minds how uncertain we are.
Yeah.
You know, the irony
What was
is,
it said on every during the GFC? There was an economist on every street corner saying a different thing.
Absolutely. So, whereas scientists, we have much higher expectations of them, which is a good thing, but you would think that would translate into more, you know, when the overwhelming number of scientists can agree,
Yep.
you'd think that's a lay down misere. The irony is, you know, one or two, you know, scientists have been used to hold up that.
But
very high degree of consensus.
we present ourselves as being holier than thou. We say, no, use the science. And then when we're able to be picked apart because there's dissenting view, which get equal media time, for example on the ABC, but other events as well, I would even say unequal in other areas, you really do lose that ability of saying, no, you don't understand, the science is the way to go, because to the public, even if it's 99-1, which is about where climate change is, it looks 50-50. And there's a big problem. I have no solution how to get out of that.
As a representative of the media, but what do you do about that? And what do you do, when an issue is put to talkback? We might even think of the super trawler, for instance. So what do you think? The politicians then respond to what they're hearing going mad in the media. How do you deal with that?
Look, I think that democracies are hard things to run, and you know the issue of free speech is sort of, we've talked about it lately, but we all accept that yelling fire in a crowded theatre is an irresponsible way to use free speech. So similarly, when we're going to have public debates about scientific issues, what's actually required is a modicum of restraint from all sides. And also, I think a willingness from the media, a willingness that's been lacking, you know, to basically call BS when they see it. And I was saying to Alex before, I mean, you don't hear lots of people on radio or in newspapers saying, I think immunisation is bad for your kids. These views can be found on the internet, and they won't be found in broadsheet newspapers, and they won't be found on mainstream news. Someone in the media is filtering that through a credibility sensor that says, well, sure, I understand you're unpersuaded by the science, but given your very lengthy degree in metallurgy, your experience in epidemiology seems a bit lacking. That's something that journalists can and do, and I know I deal with journalists all the time, and they ask me hard questions before they report our research.
But it's more complex than that, and I think if we just reflect, since I kind of got ambushed by the super trawler debate, and it's been a real eye-opener for me, and exactly the difficulties of this, and it's something I have experience with because I grew up in Alaska with a father who was a fisheries biologist who did the Alaska fisheries management. And I saw how things happen on that front up there. And the difficulty is there are a range of views from perfectly reasonable scientists across the country. And then there is an expert body that is making a decision. There may be some process issues of how their processes are done. But again, as soon as you get away from a consensus body that's trying to make the best view and you divide, the science is dead. And so in this case, we had a bunch of scientists come in. We have different levels of knowledge, in this case, from what I saw, with diverging views. They undermined the consensus body, which may or may not have needed to be undermined. I don't know the details. And so the public trust in what was going on broke down. In my opinion, as soon as the public trust breaks down, the government has to reassess what's going on. And that same process happened in climate change. You have a consensus view, not by this time by the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, but by, for example, the Australian Academy of Science. But then you have people who genuinely know their stuff, not very many, who disagree. And they get the airtime. You break down the argument. People say, well, we don't know what's going on. And so they can look out and say, we don't know what's going on, therefore we don't have to do anything. And it's a very similar thing in both cases. And what you need to have is a consensus body that people trust. But that consensus body has to have their act together and not make shortcuts, do things poorly. They have to be very honest about their decisions and the uncertainty behind them.
Yeah. Well, I agree, and in terms of the super trawler, I know nothing about the science, but I'm concerned. Part of your intuition says, oh, that seems like a big ship and that sounds bad. But
a vacuum cleaner. I think that was the line that Talkback used and the politicians heard being
Well,
used.
I know, so you have a vacuum cleaner, but the fallacy is, having seen this in Alaska, you have one big ship, or you have 100 little ones. You got to say which one's better, or which ones are okay. And, you have to be honest about
because
the
2 weeks
assessment.
before we had the government arguing for the science, and
Absolutely.
then with with that kind of imagery, it changed.
And the thing that I think is at play here is that I think there is some questions about the process of that happened to that input, and we need to look at that. People need to have that trust in it for it to work. And my own view of where we need to go on this is that we need to fix the AFMA so people have trust in it, and then let them make the decision of what to do. They are the organization that needs to make that decision eventually.
Yeah, look, I tend to agree, and I think there's a problem for the environmentalists who expressed so much concern and from one point of view did such a good job of campaigning against the vacuum cleaner. Let's be clear, what we've shown politicians is that it's popular to chuck out science if enough people make enough noise about an issue. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have any capacity to say what the right and wrong answers is. But if you think we should listen to the science on climate change, and you think we should listen to the science on water extraction from the Murray, and you're part of a campaign that says chuck out the science on fisheries, then I think you made your next battle harder to fight, not easier to fight. So the strategist in me, as well as the policy person in me, says be very careful what you wish for. Because if you use populism and catchy phrases and a label like a vacuum cleaner to overturn some science, you will reap what you sow. And you might be sowing some GM crops, or you might be sowing some very strange views about water out of the Murray, because if enough people make enough noise and make a political issue of it. And think about the Murray. I mean, it's an appalling example of evidence-based policy. Let's be clear, we had a book burning. We had a book burning, right? The government evidence, the expert evidence was gathered up.
And it was the draft of the guide, it wasn't...
But that was a book burning.
And a horse's head's been thrown,
That's how we treated evidence in that debate, and it worked. The political temperature changed after the books were burnt, and the politics of the decision, I would say.
But was there a problem in the way that was rolled out and the way it was communicated?
Look, I think it was terribly done. I don't want to distract from tonight's event. I don't think the government could have done a worse job of. Yeah. Let's be clear. It paid for that research. It rented the hall. It invited the cameras. The only thing it didn't do was give away the matches for the disaster that was that consultation.
But as near as I could tell, it also put gasoline onto the paper, so it would light up quickly when it went as well. So.
Now, look, I will break here. So if you would like to indicate if you'd like to be part of this discussion, I'd love you to. So just indicate to our lovely man in white here, and he'll bring the microphone to you. And over to the public, really, the questions about what can scientists and politicians do to better engage the public with science, and I guess that comes to education as well. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're just looking at the the draft National Curriculum for Science. And it is so chocker full of facts. And when I look at what I want my kids learning in science is a few facts, but what I really want them to understand is the scientific process. How you test simulated evidence, understanding uncertainty, what you know, what you don't know. And that's not in the curriculum at all. And when I go, and that's what I'm trying to teach the politicians when I talk to them, I'm not telling them, here, this star is this big. Well, actually, I did that as well. But when I'm really talking to them is trying to explain the scientific process. And so that's what I think it comes down to, so people understand how you make conclusions, how you understand the uncertainties of those conclusions based on evidence. That's the most important part for me.
We've got a question here.
This might come out as being really pedantic, but earlier, sorry, was it Dennis?
Yeah, Richard.
Richard Dennis, sorry about that.
I get called worse.
Well, Dennis Richards is another person, but he's the other side of town.
Anyway, there was a campaign by Australian skeptics under the Stop the Australian Vaccination Network. So have you been following this? Anything you can learn from this? Sorry, it's not really much of a question.
Oh, look,
I suppose, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to, sorry, in terms of being pedantic, I'm not saying they don't get any media. They don't get anything like the amount of media that the climate skeptics got. When it is reported, it's not reported in that 50-50 kind of way. I agree it's been harmful. And I have no scientific expertise on this, but my kids have been immunised. What I guess the point that I was trying to make is we know that there are contests about scientific conclusions, and I think climate change, we did a particularly bad job, and the media did a particularly bad job. I don't think they did a great job on immunisation, and I think there are some other areas of science where people have been let down. And let's not forget, there's a lot of people in the world who have got some very strange, unscientific views about, think about abortion and, whether the female body can, shut that whole thing down. There are unscientific views in public debate. So, but I take your point.
There's a fundamental difference between the science of climate change and immunology, which is we understand the outcomes and agree within the community with a much higher degree of unanimity in the case of immunization. I mean, it's sort of a 99.99% acceptance, and the ability to predict what's going to happen is quite good with immunology. In climate change, you have sort of this 98, 99%, and the ability to predict what's going on is quite uncertain because we have a much more complicated system that we're dealing with. And so, people say, well, why is the, climate change debate, why is it that 3 years ago it was a very large fraction of people thought, yeah, this is what's going on, and now it seems to have been dipping down below 50%. And my best answer is because we've had 2 wet years that were quite cool on the eastern seaboard of Australia. I think that's what it comes down to.
It rained.
Yeah.
Just add water.
Yeah. And people say, well, see, they have this perception that every year is going to be hotter than last. Well, that sort of has been true, but there's large fluctuations, and we could have a big volcano go off, and it could cool off quite considerably for a decade. But it could also get much, much, much warmer. There's a lot of uncertainty there.
Question here?
Hi, I'd really love to see more bridges between science, public and politicians. I read something recently which has given me a fair bit of pause. So it was an analysis of political positions in the US, and in particular, total reversal of positions that politicians took. And the social scientists who looked at it concluded that essentially accuracy was disposable for politicians, and that what was far more important was affiliation with the group. And as a scientist who sort of thinks that accuracy is not disposable, this really worried me. So I guess a question, do you see this in Australia, and it applies to both politicians and the think tank in the US, the think tanks that are affiliated with the politicians, with the political parties. Do you see this in Australia, and what implications might it have for building the bridges?
Brian?
Sorry, you want to go first?
No, I'm going to let you go first. I talk too much.
Well, look, I mean, I'm an escapee from academia. The reason I work in a think tank is I think building bridges is important. The bridges that I try to build are primarily in the social sciences. I'm an economist, but I don't think that all academic economists should read the newspaper as closely as I do. And I think that more policymakers should read more journals than they do. You know, I'm happy to sort of try and perform that role. But so I think building bridges has to have people who are motivated to do it. You can't just decree the bridge will be built. Someone has to show up and start building. As to your other observation about consistency, look, you know, economists, you know, people, I don't know about you, Brian, but non-physicists and non-scientists often think, oh, well, you know, theoretical physics, what could we ever learn from that? Economists have got these amazingly bizarre models of humans.
Based on physics.
Well, based on 18th century physics, so
well,
it's pretty
right.
linear.
Still works. They have Hamiltonians,
Yeah, exactly.
all sorts of, I mean, seriously, they really
exactly. It's very Newtonian, but my point is it's entirely theoretical. It's got no relationship to reality and never will. So the problem with economists assume, literally, explicitly assume that all people make decisions consistently. Now, that's a fundamental axiom of our model. Now, I used to work at a petrol station, and I would watch people do a U-turn over a double yellow line on the rare day that we were ½ a cent a litre cheaper than the people on the other side of the road. They would risk a $250 fine. They would put 40 litres of petrol in their car, saving themselves 20 cents, and then pay $10 a litre for a bottle of water. And who do they complain about? The oil companies. They don't complain about the water companies. So people are not consistent. People are not rational. Economists assume they are. Politicians know they aren't. So my point is that it's not irrational and it's not unsuccessful for politicians to think sometimes people will think about an issue in this way and sometimes they'll think about it in this way. And I can get away with rank hypocrisy and fundamental inconsistency as long as people have got different parts of their brain going. And that's what good politicians do, successfully, day in and day out.
Brian?
But I think, from my perspective, I want to have good politicians, ones who are out there trying to actually make the world better. Now, my experience is all of them actually are there for a reason, that they're not that cynical. They really are there. So I really want people who, you know, have an IQ probably over 75 would be good, and 100 even better. But you really need to have real statesmen, people who really do know how to think through issues. And one of the things that I have seen, and it hurts me because I did grow up in the United States, is that the average education of the United States, especially the lower third, has fallen away dramatically in my lifetime. And those people are able to be manipulated in amazing manner by cynical politicians. And it's so bad now that those bottom third are creeping into political office. And they don't actually always know what they do, I'm afraid. That, you know, so we really need a higher quality politician. And I think in Australia we have much higher quality politicians across the board. I won't say we have the highs that the US has necessarily, but we certainly also don't have the lows. So I think it's much more even. And my experience is, with a few exceptions, most of the people at Parliament House aren't going to twist things that badly, because I think they will realize it's dishonest. And I think that we need to have an educated population and who can go out and make sensible choices of who they vote for.
Look, I agree. I think Australia is relatively well represented in Parliament. I think we're a successful country, a successful democracy, no doubt about it. But let me give you an example of just how strange people's views are. Most Americans think that gun ownership is an important right. Obama's not even going to come out hard and say, I'm going to take your gun off you. Americans are very comfortable with the idea that people have to take responsibility. And that red tape, nanny state, regulationist approach is a terrible thing when it comes to gun ownership. And the fact that 13,000 people a year are shot dead in America is a small price to pay. Seriously, this is what they believe. It's politically impalatable to suggest otherwise. But while they're simultaneously that uptight about freedom to choose and responsibility, Americans are terrified of French cheese. The regulations to keep dangerous French cheese, because it could cause food poisoning. I mean, it's really very risky, that French cheese. You know, there's a political system that simultaneously says, I empower individuals to make choices.
But you'd have a few American cheesemakers behind it.
This is my point, that politics has got no problem with rank hypocrisy. Politics has got no problem with it at all.
So there's a cultural aspect to that as well, which is French cheese isn't on the cultural aspect. Wisconsin cheese, yes, but not French cheese. But, you know, you are brought up in the United States talking about the Bill of Rights, and there is a confusing, one of the amendments is confusing because it talks about the right to bear arms, which of course was referring to the state militia, but in modern parlance it actually just looks like everyone's allowed to have a gun. And that is part of what everyone hears when they're young. And so my views on many issues have changed after leaving the United States, simply because when it's banged into your head for 20 years, it's there. There's nothing you can do about it. You just think, well, this is the way it is.
What about compulsory voting?
No, I think compulsory voting is good. I like it. Whether or not, it's just never going to happen in the United States. Yeah.
I think we've got a question up there.
This is a question for both of our panelists tonight. You talked, and I quite agree with the fact that there should be an appeal in government to sort of independent research and knowledge and higher level thinking and processing and all that. But what about the minority of academics with vested interests? I mean, we saw, I think in some documentaries that are out there, economists who sit on the boards of for-profit investment banks and financial institutions, or scientists and geologists who sit in oil companies. So what do you think of that and their influence on politics and policy?
I'm going to hand that one to you, and I will come out with a holier-than-thou statement.
Look, I'm pretty holier than thou. I think transparency is key. I think that if academics are taking money from someone, they should be very, very upfront about that, not just in a footnote on what they publish. I think we should know. I don't think that linkages between academics and industry are inherently bad, but I think concealed relationships are very, very bad. But I would go back a level. I think the problem that we have is a lack of no strings attached public investment in science and research and education. And it's in an environment where everyone feels short of money that people are more inclined, in fact, potentially even encouraged, to go out and form relationships which either in reality or in perception reduce the standing of the entire system. So, if we as taxpayers are investing in science and investing in research, and we're employing good people on good money to do good research, then we should all be pretty relaxed about the findings. But if the only way for a young scientist to get their first job is to work on a jointly funded industry project, and and there's clearly commercial imperatives to find that something's safe or something's good, then that's going to taint all of it, I think. So I'm not opposed to it. I think transparency is the main thing, but I think we need to go up a level of abstraction and think, well, what's the motivations? What's the incentives here? Because I think scientists just want to do good science. It's a pity that some of them think the only way to do good science is to potentially work on projects that they might have some doubts about.
So, from my perspective, you need to get input, and this is again where I'm looking at it, a consensus group or organization. So, let's say you're looking at some area of science where science and policy are meeting. You need to have people with the expertise. Now, if you have a direct conflict of interest, that needs to be dealt with, and you need to be out of the conversation. Absolutely. But let's say you have an economist who sits on, Macquarie Bank, investment bank, and you're talking about investment in the future. So you will need that expertise in there as a general factor, but you need to counteract it with a diversity of opinion that doesn't have that conflict. So it needs to be part of the mix, but it can't be a direct conflict. And so again, I look at consensus views from bodies that have trust, and you deal with things that way. You do need to have people who are at least in the game to help provide you, but you need to offset it. And it just has to be very transparent.
Well, and you hope the media would ask when there's the latest research about chocolate being good for you, if it is being funded by Cadbury or, whatever. You hope the media does ask that question.
On that, I wind up on Alex's program from time to time, and I can't remember, but I'm sure, you introduce me as, left-wing think tank or...
He rails against it every time.
What bugs me is no one ever says right-wing representative of the banking industry came on to,
If I do John Roscombe, I say the IPA is right, right of the spectrum.
But if I'm making $30 billion a year in profits for banking, I'm a respected business person. I'm somehow civic-minded with this random advice to impart. I'm not... Seriously, think about it. If you try introducing the head of the Bankers Association as right-wing, free marketeer representative of the most profitable banking industry in the world and see what the feedback looks like. So I can take it. People want to call me left-wing, that's fine, I don't really care. But let's be clear, we don't attach labels to everybody. And some of those people are far more self-interest. Well, I don't get rich saying increase the taxes I pay. And I'm costing myself a fortune if my advice is taken. Yet I'm a biased observer on public debate, and the bankers or the miners are these incredibly respected people who get paid gazillions to make rich people even richer.
I expect that answer the next time you come on.
G'day, I'm William Medford and I'm a social sciences and law student here at ANU. But I've also been quite involved in our environment collective here at ANU, and sort of touching on the previous question, but also back to sort of the idea of politics and what politics, I guess, is about, as opposed to what science is about. And politics is about making choices and setting some sort of direction. And the problem is that at the moment, a lot of the mechanisms about where the choices are made, particularly about the environment, are to let things go ahead unless people who are opposed to it can prove that it's absolutely the wrong thing to do and definitely should be taking some action. So with climate change, as an environmentalist who believes in climate change, I think we need to take some action about climate change. But the status quo is to keep on doing as we always have done since the Industrial Revolution, increasing productivity and all that sort of stuff. Whereas with the trawler, it's similar with the trawler in that the trawler is allowed to go and start fishing unless we kick up enough fuss to stop it from happening. And it's again with coal seam gas, which the Australian National University is investing in, and scientists have been engaged as part of a panel to investigate whether we should consider stopping the coal seam gas industry from destroying our aquifers, rather than stopping and looking at what's going to happen and then making a decision. So it is about this. I think I'd like to hear more about
get to a question.
about how we can set up mechanisms so that the choices are made about science at the right points instead of just this status quo going through.
Right.
Yep. So you've given up three possible areas, and again, I think it comes down to what the evidence is. We have to make decisions, and if you want to make sure that we do no harm to the environment, I can give you the correct solution. Don't do anything. Because that is a guaranteed solution. Now, we all know we have to do some things. And so it's finding the balance. So, in climate change, we have very good evidence that we need to do something. Whether or not we have the ability as a culture, as a world, to actually take action that has significance, I have my doubts. And it is the politicians who are handed the evidence that their job is to do, to act on things on people's benefit. They haven't done a very good job thus far. The super trawler, we fish in this country. When you fish, you want to fish as, I think the idea is to fish sustainably. There is uncertainty in the science at some level, and so we could not fish at all, which is one option. But of course, we will just import our fish from places which we know are unsustainable, which is, quite frankly, what we do right now anyway. Or we can try to do the best job we can and have a very strong organization that can manage the fisheries appropriately and have the authority to stop them. So this is my problem in the case of undermining the management authority, is that, having seen what happened in Alaska in my own life, is that you go through and people say, well, we've done the right thing, because even if we've done it for the wrong reason, the fish are still in the ocean. But there are 700 decisions made a year on fisheries, and 100,000 people aren't going to complain each time. And so what happens is the political forces, which are wrong the other direction, undermine the fisheries in this country. So if we're going to keep on fishing, we need to have evidence-based as best we can. Again, in that particular case, I don't know what the correct thing to do was. I don't have the evidence in front of me. But that's why we need a strong process. So I agree, if we don't know that it's safe, we don't have any evidence it's safe, we shouldn't be doing it. So when it comes to fracking, I think the evidence is a bit of a mixed bag right now. Australian fracking is very different than North American fracking. It's hard to use that evidence. And I agree. There is some disturbing evidence. We need to think. We should pause while we figure out what's going on. And so those are the three cases. But we do need to eventually do something, and we need to have that evidence base. We can't just do nothing.
Have I got that?
Yeah.
Look, I think for me, the answer to your question comes to your question earlier. We humans and our luckily human politicians make entirely inconsistent decisions about what look like analogous problems. So sometimes we apply the precautionary principle, and sometimes we say, suck it up and let's see what's going to happen. So I'm often told that with climate change we can't act because the costs are up front, the benefits are in the future, the benefits are uncertain, and one country acting alone couldn't solve the problem. It's called a wicked problem. I don't believe that for a minute. Because when it comes to defence, we're about to spend $50 billion building 12 new submarines to replace the 6 we haven't used yet. And let's run through it. The costs are up front, tick. The benefits are in the future, tick. The benefits are uncertain. We don't know who's going to invade, what day they're coming, or where to park the submarines, let alone we can't crew the 6 we've got, but we reckon we'll be able to crew the 12. Oh, and by the way, does anyone think Australia spending $50 billion on subs creates world peace? So it's bizarre and wrong to think that something like climate change is a fundamental challenge for our democracy. It's just that we're wearing different hats. When we're wearing our defence hat, we're wearing our precautionary principle. Imagine how embarrassed I'd feel if we got invaded and I hadn't bought the subs. Whereas if we're answering our climate change problem, we're answering wouldn't I feel silly if I spent all that money on renewable energy and public transport and it turned out to be solar flares after all. That's okay, we're human. We make inconsistent decisions. We do a U-turn and risk our lives to save small amounts on petrol and waste money on water, and it's okay. But let's not tell ourselves that we can't solve a class of problems like climate change when we can. We've just chosen to wear a different hat, which it's a democracy, and we're free to be as stupid as we want.
It's getting to nearly 7 o'clock. Are we okay to take some more questions?
We haven't had any over here on this side.
Okay, just over here. Thanks, Brian.
Hi, I just had a question about media and such. You've said a few times tonight that it would help if politicians read more journal articles, but journal articles are written in a fairly obscure language that's only really accessible to the specialists in the particular discipline. What really matters is the media for general people understanding science issues, and in particular for politicians understanding science issues. But we are seeing a trend in Australia, I think, towards less media coverage of science, particularly in the mainstream media. I think it's The Australian that now no longer has a single science writer on its staff. I'm just wondering how you think that this trend towards less science media is going to impact the relationship between science and politics.
Great question.
I thought it was to you.
No, I look to Brian for that one.
Well,
we've still got Robert.
so I'm going to agree with you. I think it's hopeless to have politicians read journals, and having tried to read the Hansard, I have to admit, that was pretty hopeless as well. I do think we have an interesting time. Media in this country is making a dramatic transformation, and we have an opportunity to actually make it better, because science journalism in this country has never been good. It just hasn't had a quality behind it, hasn't had a depth. So I think we need to essentially provide that journalism through, again, some sort of organization. So for example, the universities of Australia have got together and formed something called the Conversation. And so that is a way to essentially supply quality content in science and other areas to make up for the lack of expertise. And so my vision, and I've been talking to the Conversation about this, is why don't we work with the ABC? The ABC's got a great website, but they don't have the depth of reporting on all issues. So they have the ability to give you the stories. Why don't they contract out Conversation to provide in-depth things? And the Conversation will go through and vet it and say, this is expertise, keep the ethics, and give high quality. It will be so much better than anything we've ever had. We're all ready to do it right now. Everything's in place. So we have a great opportunity.
From the ABC on that?
I haven't tried the ABC yet. I'm still
Okay.
working on the Conversation. I had this idea last week, by the way, so it's fresh.
And the Conversation is regularly viewed. I'm a general program maker, of course, so I'm not doing specialist science, but it is regularly, it's looked at every day by my team and my station.
But we can do more. We can actually get onto the stories of the day and work on them. And you guys provide a great way to essentially provide the lead stuff, and we can provide the extra content. So I think that's one. And we could even do that for the Australian and for Fairfax. Both organizations would benefit greatly from that type of content.
That might be the bell. Is there one more question? Or
She's been going.
yeah, in the green here. So thank you.
We've talked about the interaction between science, politics and the public, mostly through the media. But if we survey citizens, we find a remarkable proportion think that citizens should have ways of giving input into decision making about science and technology, particularly controversial areas like emerging technologies. So there are various trials of direct engagement between scientists, politicians, policymakers and the public and citizens. What do you think of the role of those kind of mechanisms?
Well, look, I teach a lot of sort of economics and policy courses, often to public servants, and I find it really interesting, but it scares me. I often ask people, put up your hand if you think you should make policies based on evidence, and everyone puts up their hand. And I say, now, put up your other hand if you think we should base evidence based on consultation and talking to the public. Everyone puts up their hand. Well, what are you going to do when those two spheres generate contradictory advice? And we've talked about that with water in the Murray and fisheries and climate change sometimes. So I think what we need to do, and it's imperfect, democracy is imperfect, we shouldn't beat ourselves up about this, but we need scientists to keep doing, I think, what they've always done and always tried to do, and that is be really honest about the facts. And when it comes to things like emerging technologies that are controversial, we need to have a more mature debate that says, well, there's scientific evidence over here, and there's democratic, legitimate concerns about values and fears, and we've got to be able to have both of those conversations. And if my values are different from yours, neither of us should go to the poison well of attacking the science. You know, they're both entirely different, they both generate entirely different outcomes at times, but we shouldn't let one ruin the other one.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think if you just let citizens go open loop and comment on science, well, you know, that's like asking everyone how tall the Emperor of China is and expecting to get a reasonable answer. They don't have any information. So you're asking them questions that they're ill-capable of doing. So there are some techniques that I'm aware of that have been trialed where you take groups of citizenry and you confront them with the science, say this is the evidence, these are the other issues, these are the ethical concerns, what's your make of it? And you get a sense of a group of people, of real concern, you know, how they would deal with it, and that could be input into the government. And that one makes perfect sense to me.
Is that kind of the wisdom of the crowd kind of
It's
model?
and so my wife has told me a bit about attempts to do this, where you sort of have these focus groups, but you don't push poll them. You say, here's the type of evidence the politicians are trying to sort out. So what would you do? And then, you know, they have to make hard choices. So we're not going to do this. But of course that means our tax revenue is going to drop by $50 billion. And so what are you going to cut? And so you have to give them the choices that politicians have to make and see what they do. And so I think that's actually quite an interesting way to do democracy better than maybe we do now. It's expensive, it's hard, but it at least has a chance of working.
Look, I agree, but I think it's fundamentally imperfect. And behavioural economics is this emerging area of economics where we actually went and spoke to humans and looked at how they actually made radical stuff, like really. And it's actually just psychology. But if we called it psychology, we'd have to admit we missed something for 100 years. So we gave the Nobel Prize in economics to a psychologist and called him an economist, and that's a good thing. But what the behavioural economists know is what psychologists know, and that is the way you frame the data, even with expertise, the way you frame the presentation of data affects the decision. Yeah. And doctors, with as much training as, you know, far more than average in society, doctors respond differently to moral questions framed in terms of 90% of people will live or 10% of people will die. You know, if you say, would you take this course of action knowing there's a 10% chance someone will die, you get different answers from doctors than if you ask them a related question framed in terms of 90% of people will live. Humans are a bit odd, absolutely. You know, and so my problem with let's present all the information to the public, I'm not opposed to it, but the mere fact of who gets to present the evidence and in what way is the evidence presented is in itself political.
No, I agree.
I think I will probably wrap it now. Is that okay? Is anyone feeling disenfranchised? Just what? Yeah.
Just ask it.
Yeah.
You got to use the microphone.
If you're quick.
He's fit and he's fast.
You've got a fan in Alex.
Thanks.
You know, what's not to like?
Just on the back of your comment, Richard, about framing information, I was wondering whether either of you could comment on the role of the public service in bridging that gap between science and policies, and specifically, I guess, how policymakers and scientists who are working in government might deal with the need to condense such complex information into 1 or 2 pages for briefing.
Look, I hate to say it, luckily it's only being recorded. The public sector have become terrible at it. As Alex's dilemma when she interviews me, public servants don't know how to deal with the Australia Institute's contribution to a process because they don't know whose team to put me down on. They think consultation is about getting even numbers of people who disagree with each other and putting them in a room and then showing that the problem's intractable and then telling the minister there's no way forward. No, I'm not kidding. And at the beginning of a meeting, when I'm asked to say effectively, who do you represent? And I say, I represent no one, I came because you asked me to come. The panic, you're like, sort of like, well, but we have this finely tuned, you know, logjam, and you're claiming to come at it on behalf of your opinion or your brain or your evidence. Seriously? Rather than, well, I'm on the side of the consumer and these people are on the side of industry. And so and just, sorry to rave on, but you put ads in the paper saying we're having a consultation process, here's the time that suits us, here's the terms that suit us, and by the way, in a nutshell, only vested interests will participate. Seriously. And when I say to public servants, well, you're 500 metres from ANU, have you ever rung anyone and offered them a cup of coffee to pick their brain? The answer's no. So it's your job to go and find interesting people and ask them questions, and sticking an ad in the paper and complaining that only vested interests came to your meeting is not helping anyone. Not you, everyone else.
At the public service level, Brian?
Well,
I
do see this, since I'm married to a public service, I do see the consultation program, and I would say that largely what you say, the consultation is to get out there to make sure all stakeholder concerns are understood. Yeah, there are things that come in from, think tanks, left and right. There are actually very few left think tanks. There's a lot of right ones in this country, as near as I can tell. But
donations are tax deductible.
But I do agree. The ability, there are certain areas of the public service that do this better than others. And they go out and they do try to seek advice. And they try to get out there. But they're really not encouraged to do so by the political masters right now. Frank and fearless advice is not welcome anymore. You really don't want to be told the answer. You need to be given a range of answers. So there's some incentives that are wrong right now. And I think that I see some parts of it being good. It should be there. They should be willing to get out there and say, this is our best guess. This is our best answer given on the evidence. And I'm afraid it's not brilliant. I think it's a place where we can improve. But I think maybe the easiest way to improve it in the current environment is, again, to have external trusted bodies. For example, the Crawford School that can come out and say, here's our sense of things. It's one of the reasons it's here to exist, is precisely to provide fearless advice that is external to government, so they don't have the ability to fire you when you when you actually tell the minister something he doesn't want to know or she doesn't want to know.
Look, I agree, and that's hopefully the role of the university, and it should be the role of the public sector. But I guess I would even question the fundamental belief that long consultation makes for better decision making. There's no evidence of that at all.
That's not why it's done.
No, I know.
Yeah,
this is what I was going to say. It's actually, think about climate change. If Kevin Rudd, elected in 2007, said, right, we're going to have an emissions trading scheme like John Howard agreed to before the 2007 election, bipartisan consensus. We'll introduce something half decent by midway through 2008, and then we'll make it better slowly over time. We'd have moved on 5 years ago. What we did was set up, our political and our public servants basically put a kick me sign on their bum and walked slowly past the polluters for 4 years, watching it get worse and worse and worse and worse. If consultation is just a taxpayer-funded platform for your opponents to attack you,
which it is,
and they're the ones spending hundreds of thousands of bucks to show up to your inquiries, the consultation process is actually damaging what the public service could be doing. So don't shut the doors. I'm not trying to say keep everyone out of public decision making, but let's not kid ourselves that the longer we talk about it, the better it's going to be, especially when the incentives are for people with the most to gain to participate the most.
But you still are going to need the consultation.
Yeah.
But it just needs to be reined in, everyone has their say, and then you make your best decision.
Yeah.
John Howard brought in gun laws.
Absolutely. And we go to war in Iraq, and we respond quickly to tsunamis around the world. We do make quick decisions that are imperfect, but we understand that putting them off won't help. That's part of democracy.
And just to go to both of you, one final question. If you were to have the power to change one thing right now to better integrate science and policy making, what would you do? What would you?
To integrate science and policy making, I would spend a lot more money on education, and I would spend a lot more money on science. And maybe if I could really click my fingers, I'd take the heat out of our out of our media and political debates. It doesn't help.
So for me, I think obviously having an educated society makes life easy, but short of that, I do see giving external bodies that are scientific bodies that are trusted the ability and the brand to respond collectively, and that means actually giving them some money. So for example, in the United States, there's something called the National Research Council, which I get to be part of because I'm a U.S. National Academy member. And that was set up by Abraham Lincoln to provide scientific advice impartial to the government. We don't have anything like that in this country. Everything's done ad hoc. And so it's not well coordinated. We do the best we can, but I think in the end it causes the advice to be fractured and ineffective. And so to me, setting up something like the National Research Council that could collectively answer questions like fracking, like Murray-Darley basing, rather than have that put across 7 divisions of government, each one can provide different answers. That would be a big deal for me.
Okay. Well, that brings tonight's discussion. It's been a great one, I think. Please, everyone, thank our 2 panellists, Professor Brian Schmidt and Dr. Richard Dennis.
We agree too much. We agree on too many things.